respect for our special operations forces. But I know there was an argument that I heard from some of my special operations friends back in 2006 and 2007 during the debate over the surge in Iraq, where they basically said, oh, you know, you don't need all these general purpose forces. They're just going to annoy the Iraqis. Let's just send in a few A-teams. We know how to deal with this kind of stuff. And it's true, they do know how to deal with this kind of stuff in certain situations. But I argued then, and I still believe, that the situations in Iraq, for example, was just too far gone in 2007 to imagine that even if you deployed every single A-team in the world there, they could possibly provide security to Iraq. I mean, that needed a large deployment of security forces, and the Iraqis simply didn't have reliable security forces to deploy, and so I think we had to deploy them ourselves. But then once you manage to bring violence down to a certain level and allow the political process to function, then I think it was possible to in fairly short order decrease our commitment and to pull into the background and let the Iraqis take the lead. Although even now, I think it's a mistake to imagine that the Iraqis can do it on their own. I think it was a mistake to pull out all of our forces at the end of 2011. I think that has been a recipe for increased instability and allowing al-Qaeda in Iraq to rise from their grave and to once more cause trouble. I think that was a mistake, but I think we certainly could have decreased our presence, and that's ultimately what I think everybody would desire. But I think there are real dangers of pulling out too fast, too precipitously, and imagining that our allies can deal with it on their own when they can't. And I think that's a danger that I hope we will keep in mind in Afghanistan as we make a decision about what kind of force numbers we're going to leave there after 2014. Sir? You want to, can you get the mic there?
Nick DiLeonardo from the Navy staff. In response to the Boston bombings, Mayor Bloomberg recommended reevaluating the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment in particular. I was wondering your thoughts if you thought that this would be a strategically wise decision given our current environment, or if you thought there'd be a strategic failure given that we would be surrendering power to the terrorists and every anarchist or terrorist with a pressure cooker.
I actually had not heard Bloomberg say that. What exactly did he suggest?
The need to reevaluate elements of the Constitution to allow for greater surveillance powers of the police.
Well, again, I had not heard Bloomberg say that. I don't think there's going to be much support for amending the Constitution, but I think there's a lot you can do without amending the Constitution. And I think we actually have done quite a bit since 9/11. I think, there's kind of a spectrum of power that we have, and I think we were too far on one end before 9/11, and arguably we may have swung too far immediately afterwards when there was the immediate alarm about follow-on attacks, about what perhaps an exaggerated notion of the threat posed by al-Qaeda to the homeland, but it was certainly an understandable reaction to the worst terrorist attack in history. And then, of course, we passed a lot of legislation, the Patriot Act, and trying to bring domestic law enforcement and foreign intelligence gathering closer together, expanding authority for wiretaps, setting up military tribunals, setting up the detention facility, Guantanamo, and so forth. And I think some of that was probably certainly was judged to be, a few years later, an excessive exercise of executive power. But I think there was a little bit of scaling back of what we did after 9/11. But essentially, I think Congress more or less ratified, with a few changes on the margins here and there, essentially the more robust counterterrorism policies that President Bush had put into effect. And I think now President Obama, in fact, has implicitly or explicitly ratified most of those policies by keeping them in effect. I mean, if anything, stepping up the use of drone strikes, for example. But he certainly has not renounced the enhanced surveillance powers after 9/11. He certainly has not closed Guantanamo Bay detention facility. So I think at the moment we actually have, it's always, you want to be careful about saying there's a consensus, but I think there's pretty close to a consensus in terms of what we need to do on counterterrorism. I think there's pretty broad bipartisan support for the counterterrorism regime as it's evolved in the years since 9/11. Now, prior to the Boston bombing, I think there was a sense of complacency about the threat that we faced. And I think there were more people who were arguing, maybe it's time to close Gitmo, Maybe it's time to stop renditions. Maybe it's time to even repeal the authorization for the use of military force against al-Qaeda when we pull out of Afghanistan in 2014. This was a recommendation from a study, from a task force put together by an organization called the Constitutional Project, which released its report last week. I think a lot of that was really complacency and this imagining that because we had not been hit in a significant way since 9/11 that the threat no longer existed. Well, I think if the terrible attack on the Boston Marathon has taught us anything, it's that the threat still exists. We can't afford to let down our guard. And we need to do things like what, for example, the NYPD has been criticized for doing. I mean, the NYPD has instituted the most robust counterterrorism measures of any police department in the country, including very active surveillance programs of suspected Muslim radicals, which have been criticized by the Associated Press and the ACLU and others as being an infringement upon civil liberty. I don't think it is an infringement on civil liberty. It is, in fact, the best protection that civil liberties can have because the NYPD has kept our city safe. And it has prevented greater infringements on our civil liberties, which would almost certainly occur if there were another 9/11 or even a much smaller attack. In fact, it's a model that I think Boston and other cities would do well to emulate, a very active defense program. But I don't think we need to amend the Constitution to enable any of this to occur. It's all constitutional. It's just a question of how we use the powers that are contained therein. And I think we've been, thanks to the hard work of many of you in this room and many in the intelligence community and law enforcement, I think we've been doing a pretty good job of using these enhanced powers to keep our country safe, even though we must acknowledge that no defense is ever going to be perfect.
Hi, my name is David Allball. I'm worker in the Pentagon Library. I was in the Pentagon on 9/11. But what I just would like to ask you, in Vietnam, we tried to do some of the same things the British did in Malaya. We had a strategic hamlet program there in the early years when Diem was in power. As I recall, that not only helped the guerrillas infiltrate the hamlets and all, and why? I'm just wondering, why did what we did in Vietnam fail when we did at least sometimes try and do what the British did in Malaya? And also, maybe this goes a little bit more. We fought a similar war in the Philippines around 1900, where we suppressed the Philippine Republican movement. Can you give any light on why we succeeded in the Philippines and why we failed in Vietnam? Thanks.
Okay, sure. Well, you're right, there were some superficial similarities between the British campaign in Malaya and the American campaign in Vietnam, in part because the British actually sent an advisory mission to Vietnam, and they advised Diem to do things like the strategic hamlets. The problem was he and his brother did a terrible job of implementing it. They grew the program much too fast. They created hundreds of strategic hamlets almost overnight, and they didn't actually have the security forces to secure all those hamlets. As a result, they were infiltrated by the Viet Cong, and the effort failed. I mean, it's not enough to have a good idea. You have to have good implementation, and they had terrible implementation. And what essentially happened is these efforts to implement a coin strategy, which British advisors were urging in the early 1960s, were not successful, in part because they were not well implemented, in part because North Vietnam kept ratcheting up the amount of effort it was making to infiltrate the South. And so, then one of the prerequisites for successful counterinsurgency is to build up effective governance. And, probably the most effective president that South Vietnam ever had was, as we know, assassinated in an American-backed coup. And so that increased instability further in South Vietnam and made them very hard put to resist northern aggression. And of course, that led to our decision in 1965 to begin sending large numbers of American ground troops who were employed in a very conventional way by General Westmoreland, who was, a great veteran of World War II and Korea, but did not really understand the different style of warfare in which he was confronted in Vietnam. He imagined that he could win with greater firepower. I mean, it didn't work out that way. There were certainly alternatives out there. I mean, The Marines, for example, with their combined action platoons, I think were a very effective counterinsurgency program. I think later on, the Phoenix program, some of the things that Cords did, especially under Colby after 1968, I think were very effective and really, after the Tet Offensive, I think we got our act together and started to be pretty effective and focused in our counterinsurgency campaign. But by then it was too late because the overly conventional approach that General Westmoreland insisted on created huge numbers of casualties on both sides and ultimately broke the will of the American public to continue the war effort, something that almost happened again, by the way, in Iraq in 2007. I can't guarantee you, certainly, that even if we'd had a better counterinsurgency approach from the beginning, that we would have prevailed, because it was a very tough adversary, very skilled in the art of insurgent warfare. General Giap and President Ho Chi Minh were two of the foremost insurgents of the 20th century, with a battle-hardened army that had already driven the French out of Indochina. But I think we would have had a better chance if we tried to implement more of a counterinsurgency and less of a conventional approach. If we had used less firepower, for example, as the British had done in Malaya. Your other question was about what about the American response to the uprising in the Philippines from 1899 to 1902, which was certainly marked by some notorious abuses, the use of the water cure, as they then referred to waterboarding. There were certainly some killings of innocent Filipinos, all of which caused a scandal in the early 1900s and became an election issue, with Samuel Clemens and others denouncing the barbarism and savagery of American forces. But ultimately, I would say the reason why our troops were successful in the Philippines is that their conduct was actually probably a lot closer to the British in Malaya than it was to the French in Algeria, in part because they paid attention to the political requirements of a war of this type. They were not fighting to prolong an American empire indefinitely. In fact, while they didn't offer to give up total control of the Philippines, they certainly devolved power very quickly and gave the Philippines a large measure of self-rule, even as they remained a nominal part of the American empire up through the end of World War II. And by doing this, they managed to co-opt a lot of the Filipino elites, a lot of the people of the Philippines, and to make the Philippines relatively quiet after the capture of Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the insurrection, except, of course, for the uprising by the Moros, by the Muslim groups in the southern Philippine Islands, which was going on long before then and continues to this very day. That's an insurgency that doesn't seem to ever go away. But in terms of the rest of the Philippines, I think we managed to deliver pretty good governance. And that was enough to satisfy the people of the Philippines that they didn't have to continue fighting indefinitely. Sir?
I'm afraid it's after 3. Perhaps Mr. Booth can stay and take a few more questions at the podium. But please join me in thanking our speaker.